So this is part 2 of the lecture, and it's about health and healing. This is one of my favorite parts of the course because this is the area in anthropology that I specialize in. I'm a medical anthropologist. So what we'll be learning about in this part of the lecture is the various kinds of ways that people conceptualize what health or illness are, and all the different kinds of practices that people in different parts of the world engage in to try to heal someone when they are ill. So what I'm going to talk about in this video is all the most important things that medical anthropologists think about when they're thinking about health, illness, and healing around the world. So the first has to do with just thinking about health across the world. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, anthropologists are really interested in thinking comparatively and societies. And that includes both the ways that, for example, folks in different parts of the world imagine and do things in a sort of culturally specific way, so that kind of variability, but also all the things we have in common, right? The ways that we share a common humanity. So health is an interesting subject to think about in terms of both those commonalities and those differences. So we share the same basic biology in our bodies, right? We're part of the same human species. But in fact, what we find is both for cultural and for economic and political reasons, people have very different sort of health experiences and health challenges in different places in the world, okay? So what I want to start with is really talking about global health disparities. That is the ways that politics and economics inform both what makes people ill, what they die of, what their chances are of surviving or of living a long life. So some of the differences in those sort of disease profiles in different parts of the world. And then later in the lecture, we'll turn to looking at how people in different parts of the world culturally elaborate notions of illness and practices around healing, okay? So starting with global health disparities, the chapter you read in the Perspectives book talks about the epidemiological transition. So that is the shift with the advent of things like better nutrition, vaccinations, clean water, etc. The shift sort of historically from people commonly being made ill and dying from infectious diseases to, in many societies, that not being the case. One point that I think it's really important to understand is that epidemiological transition has not happened consistently everywhere in the world. That in fact, if we look globally, we can find very different disease profiles, particularly between what is often referred to as the global north and the global south. The global north being Western Europe, North America, the United States, and the global south being developing countries, which in general have more poverty, fewer resources, and less in terms of sort of health infrastructure, okay? So if we look again at those global patterns, we'll find that in the global south, in general, you'll find quite low or certainly lower life expectancy, high child mortality, and the diseases that take people's lives are more commonly infectious diseases, as opposed to in the global north, where we find that people are more likely to die of degenerative diseases. Degenerative diseases being the diseases that typically tend to affect you more in later life, right? Infectious diseases can afflict you at any point in your life. So in the global south, we have more people who are affected by infectious disease and therefore have their lives cut short. So when we look at that pattern, which is quite stark, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute to illustrate that, one of the things to keep in mind is that these are not sort of natural differences. These are not about differences in people's biologies. These are differences that are a result of political and economic inequities. People in the poorer parts of the world have less access to both preventative and curative health care, and it means that they are more likely to have their lives cut short by treatable diseases. So let me show you a little bit of data just to illustrate that. So this is a map that illustrates life expectancy. Okay, so how long on average people in that society live. So if you look at the bottom, you can see the sort of color coding on this spectrum here, right? From lower, the red is lower life expectancy, the blue is higher, right? So we've got a life expectancy range here from in the 40s to in the 80s, right? And when you look at the world map, right, it's not an accident that life expectancy is variable in the way that it is, right? So if you look at somewhere like Canada or the United States, there's some quite high life expectancy, right, in the 70s and 80s. If you look at the African continent, you have a shocking difference, right? So bear in mind what these numbers are. The red color is in the 40s, right? Even this sort of pale orange is only 60 years. So much of the African continent has a life expectancy of less than 60, and in some places it's as low as in the 40s. So, you know, this is a totally unacceptable phenomenon, one, that people's lives are cut short because of lack to basic resources that are certainly available in other places in the world. But this, again, gives you that sense of how different health is for people depending on the political and economic context in which they live. Let's break down that down a little bit more. I mentioned that there's a difference between people who are more likely to be affected by infectious disease versus degenerative disease. So this is some data from a few years ago from the World Health Organization looking at the causes of death in different regions in the world. So if you look at the Americas, right, this is all of the Americas, so it's not just the United States, but you'll see that, for example, heart disease and diabetes are near the top of the list. Likewise, this is in South and East Asia. You have some of those same things, heart disease, stroke. In Europe, same thing, heart disease, stroke, some other issues, things like even Alzheimer's here, which is a disease that tends to afflict people in older age. When we look at the African region, we see a totally different sort of ordering. The number one cause of death being respiratory infections, followed by HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases, which are the result of people having to drink water that is not clean, malaria, which is a totally both preventable and treatable disease, which, as you probably know, carried by mosquitoes. So this is not a disease that anyone should have to die from. We have the medications to treat it, yet it is one of the biggest killers on the African continent. So again, the African region is the poorest region in the world, so it's not, it's not an accident. There's a clear pattern here that it is that poverty and that disenfranchisement in the global community that means that African people are more likely to fall victim to these preventable and treatable diseases. Let me zoom in on one example, because in addition to making this point about global patterns in terms of health and illness, I also want to suggest that it's something that we see all over the world. So it's not the case that, for example, everybody in the United States has equal access to excellent health care. We have some of the same inequities that we see globally. We have a microcosm of those inequities within the United States and within other wealthier parts of the world. Okay, so let me start with an example. First, talking about the sort of global context, and then we can look at the local context and how this plays out in the city of Chicago. So if we take one disease, cervical cancer, and we look at who the women are who are dying of cervical cancer. Again, bear in mind that this is one of the most preventable and curable forms of cancer. We have a vaccination for cervical cancer, and with early detection, it is quite treatable. Okay, So this is something that we actually already have the technologies and the protocols to deal with quite well, in fact. However, and again, here's another one of those maps that sort of has a color coding that shows where people are more likely to die of that particular condition. You see how variable this is globally, and you see the degree to which the African continent bears the brunt of those high mortality rates from cervical cancer. So indeed, the rates of cervical cancer in Africa are up to 6 times higher than in North America. One of the main reasons we find women dying of cervical cancer in Africa is that they do not get that early detection or that preventative care, right? Early screening, as I mentioned, is one of the most effective ways to decrease the mortality rate from this particular cancer. But if those examinations, those screenings are not happening because there simply is not the health infrastructure, then unfortunately, when it is detected, it is often difficult then to effectively treat it. So you have a higher percentage of women actually dying from that cancer. So again, here is a clear sort of one example of exactly the disparities, the broader disparities that I was talking about. Now, you might think, right, well, we live in a major city in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, so this is not something we have to think about locally, but in fact we do. So we were just talking about the disparities in cervical cancer death rates globally and the difference between those rates in the U.S. versus other parts of the world, particularly the African continent. Now, here is a map of cervical cancer deaths in Chicago. You can see, again, the same kind of use of different shadings, different colors on the map to indicate where the highest death rates are. And what you can clearly see is that those death rates are not evenly distributed across the city of Chicago, right? And one of the reasons for that is that the death rates in poorer neighborhoods are higher, right? And again, it's all those same reasons. People have less access to screening, early screening. They have less access to good quality care if they are diagnosed. So we have people on the south side of Chicago, women on the south side of Chicago, dying at a much higher rate from this, again, typically preventable and treatable cancer than we do for the women living on the north side of Chicago. So the point I want to make here is that we see the sort of those same global health disparities are mirrored in a sort of microcosm in the local disparities we see across this city. And we would see that across every U.S. city, right? That the poorer parts of our country, the poorer neighborhoods, you're going to see a different disease profile than you do in the wealthier neighborhoods. So we need to think about what can be done to increase everyone's access to quality health care, not only in the city of Chicago, but globally. But we can certainly start right now with trying to work on how to get more cancer screening, prevention, and treatment to these communities on the south side. Okay. As an aside, I am working with a group of colleagues, both here at Northeastern and at a couple of other universities in Chicago, on a project that we call Chicago Check, which is the Chicago Cancer Health Equity Collaborative. And we are working precisely on this issue of the disparities in cancer health in the city of Chicago. And we're working on a bunch of different things, including research and community outreach and other ways to try to bring more equity to people's experiences with cancer. So if you see anything, we do various events and we have some training opportunities for students at Northeastern. So if you see any messages about Chicago Check, feel free to email me about it because I am one of the faculty involved in that. And it's a really important issue, and we're always looking for students who are interested in trying to help us fight for greater equity in people's health. Okay, So I want to change gears a little bit here because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, I wanted to talk about that key issue of sort of global health disparities as a key issue in the anthropology of health and illness. But I also want to talk a little bit about some of the other things that medical anthropologists do, because we're also very interested in thinking about how health, illness, and healing are understood cross-culturally, right? So we've just been talking about sort of how politics and economics influence what makes people ill, what they die from, etc. We can also then look at how people in different parts of the world think about what illness is and where it comes from, what kinds of healing practices people use, meaning who are the people who act as healers in a society, and then what kinds of techniques of diagnosis and treatment do they use. We're, as folks living in the United States, most of us, I think, understand a sort of default when we think about who healers are and what it means to be treated for an illness. The default is to think about biomedical treatments, right? What you would find if you typically go to a doctor's office or to a hospital or to a clinic, right? That is the dominant medical form in the U.S. And in much of the Western world. It's not the only one, though. And in the city of Chicago and everywhere else in the United States, we have a lot of other kinds of practitioners and healers working, right? So it's one of the things that we want to think about in this part of the lecture is that biomedically oriented healthcare is one form of response to illness. It's not the only one, and it's quite interesting to compare those different forms and think about how they've emerged in different places and at different times. So I want to run now through these categories of illness, that is both the kind of how people understand what the causes of illness are and what the categories of illness are. Healers, meaning who are the people that you go to when you get sick. Diagnosis, meaning what are the techniques that people use to try to figure out what's going on. And then treatment, what are the procedures, the medicines, or other things that are applied to try to help you get better. Okay, so we'll start with illness categories. And your text talked a bit about this, and the fact that in different places and times, illness is understood to be caused by different kinds of things. In some contexts, illness can be understood to be caused by another person. In some contexts, it may be understood to be natural, caused by natural forces. It may also be understood to be caused by emotion or by spiritual elements. And one of the most interesting ways to think about this variability in cultural understandings of illness is to look, in fact, at culturally specific illnesses. Your book mentions several of these. So I've got some images here to illustrate a few examples of culturally specific illnesses. One example that your book gave was the condition called susto, which is and this is a painting that's meant to sort of illustrate that. And this is a condition that we find in many parts of Latin America, and it is an illness that is understood to be caused by being frightened or startled. And it can still have many very significant effects for people, even as the cause is an emotional state, right? This is a culturally specific illness. We don't find this everywhere in the world. We find this to be quite common in one region. Likewise, the condition of anorexia nervosa, your book mentions that as well, right? In which an individual, and this is something that typically afflicts young women, and primarily in the West, in Western Europe and the United States, although it has, in fact, sort of spread over time. It's more commonly found in other parts of the world as well now. But it's a condition in which, again, typically young women restrict food to the point of starvation and even death. Again, this is a culturally specific illness. When I say it's culturally specific, I'm not saying it's not real or it's made up. I'm saying it's something that we find in one cultural world and not everywhere, right? So this is a typically Western illness, right? And we can talk about sort of why culturally specific illnesses emerge. They often tell us something about the society in which they exist, right? So anorexia is often tied to ideas of women striving for a certain kind of bodily perfection, and that the various kind of societal pressures that lead people to behave in that way. Another example of a sort of Western culturally specific illness is a historical illness that we don't find anymore. But in the 19th century, it was a condition that was quite common among middle class and upper middle class Western and American women, called hysteria. So this painting up here is an example of that. And again, it was both specific to certain regions and specific to a particular time period. But it was quite devastating and had significant health effects on numerous women who were afflicted again by this condition that was known at the time as hysteria. So, this is to say, that illnesses are not just biological phenomena, they are also cultural phenomena. And ideas about where they come from vary from place to place. So moving on then to the next sort of element, we can also talk about who acts as healer and what kind of setting healers operate in. So if we start with the sort of the standard in most places in the U.S., we find, again, that biomedical model where we expect to find a doctor at a doctor's office. We expect to find care taking place in a hospital setting. And this is, of course, George Clooney from his ER years, not a real doctor, but whatever. He can pretend to be our doctor for this slide. A typical waiting room, right? If you go to see a doctor, you often have to sit in a room like that. If you get hospital care, you'd be in a room with sort of equipment that looks something like this, right? So this is the sort of the typical healer and setting for being treated that you would find in the U.S. Now, that doesn't look the same everywhere. My own research is on traditional healers in southern Africa in a country called Mozambique. And these are some of the healers that I met there. These two individuals, this gentleman and this woman, are both healers who operate in a sort of Christian vein. So they are considered to be healers or doctors, right? They treat people's illnesses, often by applying, these are actually medicinal plants, but they also work with spirits who are Christian in nature. They are possessed by spirits that are associated with characters from the Bible stories. This is another healer from Mozambique. She works in a somewhat different way. She also works with a spirit, but it's not a Christian spirit. It's a sort of a local indigenous spirit that takes the form of an animal. So all of these, though, are healers, right? These are the local doctors, and these are essentially their hospitals, right? And indeed, if you see this is her hospital, right? And it even says hospital, which is what this word is. It looks a little different. It looks a little different than the doctor's office in the previous slide, but this is a parallel form, but that just is a little bit variable from what we might expect to find in Chicago. You can also think about diagnosis, right? What are the techniques that are used to try to figure out what's going on with a person? Again, if we're going to go to a biomedical healthcare practitioner in Chicago or somewhere else, we might find some of these kinds of diagnostic techniques, either examining a patient using various tools and techniques, whether it's an X-ray, drawing blood and examining that sample, listening to the heart. These are some of the sort of diagnostic practices in the context of biomedicine. Back to what I experienced in Southern Africa, these were some of the diagnostic techniques. So this gentleman is a healer who used a sort of divining instrument, which was made out of an animal horn, which would help him to understand what was wrong with one of his patients. This individual, again, working in a Christian vein, used a mirror as part of the technique for seeing what was going on with one of his patients. This woman used a Bible as a technique. So, again, quote unquote, reading what's going on with a patient using some kind of either an object or a mechanism for gathering that information. Okay, so there's a parallel process of diagnosis, but it's a process that looks quite different. We can look then at treatments, right? Once the health practitioner figures out what is wrong with the patient, what happens next, right? We might, again, in a biomedical context, expect for there to be some kind of pharmaceutical, could be surgery, etc. And elsewhere in the world, it might take a different form. This is a woman who is selling medicinal substances. This is actually in Ghana, where I've traveled with students in the past years. So these are all plant-based medicines that she vends. So if you have a complaint, you might go to her, and she's sort of the local pharmacist. She would put together the right combination of plants for you to either steep in water and drink as a tea or some other application. Again, in the sort of Christian context where I was studying Christian healers in my field site, even something like laying the Bible on top of someone's head or on their body is considered a part of treatment. And also in this setting, often treatments involved expressive culture, right? Music, dance, gatherings of like-minded individuals. So what we also find in many places in the world is that treatments for health concerns may involve not only individual bodies, but social bodies, all right? So that is, coming together in a group can be part of the therapy. What is going on in an individual body is not always understood to be just about that sort of one biological entity, but is part of the social connections across people. So again, unlike the biomedical setting, right, most Western doctors will be treating an individual body, but in many other places in the world, we find that health is understood to be something that affects a social body. And I want to end with another key concept from medical anthropology that applies really to all of the things that we've been talking about today. And that is the concept of medical pluralism. So, I started by mentioning that in Chicago, while the default or the most common form of healing is that of medically trained physicians, right, or hospitals. But the fact is, in Chicago, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of health practices and healers all coexisting side by side. So in Chicago, you can certainly go to a hospital and be examined or treated by a person with a medical degree. Or you can also go see an herbalist, a specialist in, for example, Chinese herbal medicine. Or you can go get acupuncture. Or you can go get a Reiki treatment or a massage or any other of a number of different kinds of treatments. So when medical anthropologists think about that kind of setting, right, where there's lots of different kinds of practitioners you could go to and lots of different kinds of healing practices all in the same social space, we refer to that as medical pluralism. Multiple health and healing regimes existing side by side in the same space. And the fact of the matter is that what we find is most places in the world are medically plural, right? So I mentioned my own field research in Southern Africa. those places also have people with MDs alongside the healers who are possessed by spirits, and alongside folks who are herbalists and a variety of other kinds of treatment possibilities. So all of this is just to say is that health and healing are very complex and variable elements of the human experience, both the reasons that we get sick and then what we do in response to that. And people in most places in the world, when they do experience illness, have some kind of decision to make, right? What do I do and who do I go to? Usually there's some amount of choice there. So medical pluralism is not an exception, it is more the rule. That's certainly what medical anthropologists have found. So I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences, either with illness or with healing. I'm sure plenty of you have engaged with various kinds of healers and various kinds of healing practices. This is very much a part of what medical anthropology is interested in. So we'll close there, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.